Oh, hello. It seems we have a guest. Whatever can I do for you, stranger? Oh, you're curious about my little world down there. I guess I can tell you a little about it. Let's start with its people. They shape the world down there almost as much as I do. How about an Arctic wolf shifter whose rise from tool to leader should certainly be intriguing. Enjoy the tale, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Name: Von Nightshade. Race: Arctic wolf shifter. Sex: male. Age: 15. Height: very tall. Shape: sports. Magic class: ice elemental. Affinity: occupation: none. Affiliation: urban hunting club, Yuki club, book club, drama club, Aurora Fang pack, birth pack, Jade Claw clan, Lunar Claw pack, pack lead, Greenpeace village guardian, LaFay family. Animal to call: family, Quentin Nightshade father, Lisa Nightshade mother. Relationships: Valentine LaFay boyfriend, Theodore Shire best friend, Jason Hearthsong friend lieutenant, Gekka Bishop confidant, Irma Evergreen friend writer. Background: Vaughn was born in the northern city of North Point in an Arctic wolf shifter pack known as the Aurora Fang. The pack ran its territory on harsh winters and harsher expectations. Pups were raised to be tough, loyal, and ready to lay their lives down for their Alfric or any other authority. Vaughn grew up knowing one simple fact: vampires ruled the north, owning a majority of the land the local packs lived on. Because of this, they were beholden to them, which for Vaughn meant that wolves obeyed. The best fate he could hope for was to serve as an aide to some petty vampire squabble. When Vaughn was 6, his pack was summoned to present their children to one of the young LaFay family heirs, Valentine. The elders framed it as a duty and an honor. Certain vampires could call specific creatures, and for the LaFay family, that animal had always been wolves. Valentine needed practice, and his pack was one of many whose participation was mandatory. The adults told Vaughn and the other kids to resist as best they could. They explained that compliance was inevitable, but that Valentine would never learn to channel this magic properly. If the wolves just rolled over the second he called, the children were lined up with others from neighboring packs, all around the same age. One by one, Valentine called, and one by one, the young wolves braced, shook, fought, and finally obeyed. Vaughn watched each of them lose the fight they had been ordered to put up. He dug his claws into the snow and waited for the same crushing pressure to hit him, trying to decide which would be worse, resisting too hard or giving in too fast. When his turn finally came, the feeling that washed over him was not the brutal compulsion he had been warned about. Valentine's voice slid into his mind like an invitation, not a command. Vaughn felt a pull toward him that was deeper than fear and different from submission. Before he could think better of it, he lunged forward, closing the distance between them, not because something was forcing his body to move, but because some part of him needed to stand at this boy's side. Valentine reached out to touch him, meaning only to praise a successful calling. The instant his hand met Vaughn's fur, something locked into place. Vaughn knew with a certainty that made his heart pound that he could never be parted from this vampire without it breaking something essential. Later, people would explain it in technical terms. Very rarely, a specific vampire and a specific animal within their animal to call spectrum were so compatible that their connection leapt past the usual bond and forged an imprint instead. In that moment, all Vaughn understood was that his life had just been split into a before and an after. Vaughn left the Aurora Fang that same day and went to live with Valentine. It was supposed to be a practical arrangement. The La Fay family needed their newly imprinted wolf close at hand, and the Aurora Fang elders could hardly argue with a bond that strong. In practice, it meant that Vaughn grew up in the shadow of the La Fay Manor instead of Aurora Fang territory, learning vampire etiquette and Yuki Ona magic drills alongside Valentine. The imprint changed more than his loyalties. Valentine was not only a vampire, but also a Yuki Ona, and the bond carried his ice into Vaughn's blood. In the weeks that followed, Vaughn learned to feel the cold as something he could shape. Ice answered him as readily as it did Valentine. In his Arctic wolf form, he could grow plates and spines of frozen armor along his body, turning himself into a living weapon of teeth, frost, and glass-hard shields for a boy who had been raised to believe he existed only to be used by the vampires. It was jarring to discover that Valentine looked at him not as a tool, but as a partner. The rest of the world still saw him as Valentine's animal, the rare wolf who had imprinted with their heir inside the walls. Day by day, it became something else. Valentine trained, studied, and schemed with Vaughn at his side. Through him, Vaughn met Theodore Shire, the human mage boy, whose missing brothers were the reason Valentine pushed himself so hard. The two were clearly in love. Vaughn could tell that much from the way Valentine spoke of Theo in private. Vaughn guarded Valentine through cold nights and bad thought spirals, and the weight of La Fay expectations that never quite let up. The two of them learned the edges of the imprint bond by living in it, how long they could be apart before it hurt, and how much strength they could pour into each other without snapping anything. Somewhere in the middle of all that repetition and responsibility, they stopped being a vampire and his wolf and simply became Vaughn and Valentine. By the time either of them was old enough to name it, they were no longer just imprinted partners. They were in love. By the time Vaughn was 10, the shape of his future had already been decided. Theo's brothers were still missing, trapped in a rival vampire manor that treated humans as toys and cattle. Valentine had decided years ago that he would be the one to tear that place apart and drag them out, and Vaughn had decided just as firmly that he would be at Valentine's side when it happened. Every drill, every long night of magic control and combat practice kept looping back to the same unspoken goal. They were training for a war they were not yet allowed to fight. The person who finally snapped that waiting period in half was a girl named Irma Evergreen. She was taken and imprisoned by a patrol from the same family that had kidnapped Theo's brothers. Irma managed to slip her chains long enough to cause real damage, and the vampires in charge decided to make an example out of her. They tortured her, broke her body, and then left her out in the snow near La Fay territory as a warning. By the time Vaughn and Valentine found her, she was barely alive. Valentine refused to let her die alone, and forgotten in the snow, he used his ice to preserve what was left of her and carried her back to their manor. The choice he made next was the same kind of choice that had marked him as a monster and an illegitimate heir to some in his family. Once already, to save her, he turned her, binding her to his ice and reshaping her into an ice wraith. Irma had always been a sculpture-mancer, able to shape and imbue detail into whatever material she worked with, and the turning welded that gift to Valentine's ice. When she woke, she could create, carve, and animate frozen constructs with terrifying precision, calling up jagged statues and moving walls out of snow and frost. It gave her a second chance at existing on her own terms, even if those terms were nothing like the life she had lost. It was Vaughn who reached her first in that new state. He knew what it was to have your entire life rewritten, to wake up as something the world would only ever see as a weapon. He made a point of being there when the ice wraith hunger hit, grounding her with steady presence and quiet explanations of what had been done to keep her alive. Bit by bit, Irma learned to steady herself against him. Somewhere in the repetition of practice runs and shared patrols, they formed a bond of their own. That bond finally crystallized when Irma became his rider. One night on patrol, Irma climbed onto his back while he was in his Arctic wolf form so they could move faster across the snow. The magic caught on that contact and locked in, knitting her ice and his together. From then on, whenever Irma rode him in Arctic wolf form, they could pour strength into each other, moving and striking as a single unit. Their enemy's warning had accidentally created exactly what it had meant to destroy. Vaughn gained a rider who could amplify his power and see the battlefield from above his shoulders, and Irma gained a foundation she trusted enough to anchor her new existence. Irma never forgot what had been done for her. She understood that she was only alive because Valentine had refused to let her die, and because Vaughn had stood between her and the worst of the aftermath. In the quiet hours after training, she told them so, not with flowery speeches, but with blunt promises. She swore that as long as she still lived, she would serve the two of them. She would follow their lead and fight their enemies until her last breath. That solidified the three of them as an inseparable trio. Valentine's relationship with Theo only deepened as the three of them closed ranks. Theo became a constant presence, a human in the middle of vampire politics who refused to back down from what he wanted. For Valentine, that meant more long nights of planning and more brutal, self-imposed training sessions, pushing his Yuki Onna magic to its limits so he would be strong enough to keep his promise. For Vaughn, it meant watching the way Valentine softened around Theo, the way the mission to rescue his brothers had never been an obligation. Instead, it was a vow between them, and, to Valentine, a proof of his devotion to Theo. By the time Jace LaFay, Valentine's older brother, finally decided they were strong enough to challenge the manor, none of them were the same people who had started training for it. Vaughn was not just an imprinted wolf anymore. He was Valentine's partner in every sense, Irma's chosen mount, and one of the few people Theo trusted. Irma was no longer a discarded warning in the snow. She was an ice wraith with a magic that could freeze a battlefield, riding a wolf who could turn his own body into armor. Theo was no longer just a frightened boy with missing brothers. He was the center of a promise that all three of them had bound themselves to, as well as Valentine's human servant and lover. When Jace finally gave the word that they would be moving on the manor, it felt less like a command from above and more like permission to finally do what they had all been straining toward for years. After 2 years of planning, the raid on the manor had the feeling of a story they had all told themselves too many times. Jace LaFay handled the outer planning and the politics, forcing the Vampire Council to look him in the eye and either back the mission or admit they were willing to leave Theo's brothers behind. Inside the strike team, the lineup was lean on purpose. Valentine would be the spearpoint, taking the front with his ice. Vaughn would break the path beside him, a shifter wolf in armor, built to tear through other monsters, with Irma on his back, ready to carve the battlefield into something that belonged to them. Theo came as a capable mage in his own right, wrapped in wards and stubbornness. Jace anchored the formation, and at his shoulder walked his human servant Philip Cromwell, another powerful mage who had no intention of being dead weight. Sky Bramble moved with them as well, a Winter Fae presence, tied to a Luke by more than just loyalty. He was there as a Luke's boyfriend, and as another weapon aimed at the manor. They approached the estate under cover of snow that did not fall by accident. Valentine dragged a blizzard down over the grounds, muting sound and sight until the whole place looked swallowed by winter. Vaughn padded through the drifts at his side in Arctic wolf form, Irma sitting on his back, one hand ready with sculpted ice. Theo and Philip walked in the wake of that vanguard, magic already humming under their skin, while Jace and Sky watched the flanks for any sign of movement. They were not there to posture or send warnings. They were there to take something back. The first clash was fast and ugly. Vampires poured out from the outer buildings, some half feral from feeding, and some smug in the belief that these intruders were just another group to be broken on their doorstep. Valentine answered with walls of ice and sudden spikes, freezing attackers mid-lunge. Vaughn hit the ones that got through, armored shoulders slamming bodies aside, jaws closing on anything that came too close to his people. Irma threw up barricades and moving sculptures, her constructs catching blows that would have landed on flesh. Theo and Philip cut in from behind with precise bursts of magic, knocking enemies off balance or tearing weapons from their hands, while Sky turned the storm itself into a weapon. Carnivorous plants that thrived in the freezing tundra sprang from the earth, laced with a dark power that sapped the magic from anyone they struck. Together, they forced a path straight toward the heart of the manor. Inside, the corridors were narrow and wrong, lined with doors that all smelled like fear and fresh blood. They had to move quickly, ripping locks apart, checking rooms, and moving on when they did not find the Shire brothers. Theo walked close to Jace now, not out of fear, but because that was where the decisions were being made. Every time a door opened on another stranger, another ruined life, Theo flinched and Valentine's control tightened. They freed who they could without breaking pace. The mission was not to empty the manor. It was to find 2 specific boys and get them out before the whole place came down on their heads. Vaughn and Irma took point through the inner halls, his senses tracking the faintest trace of Shire scent under all the noise. Irma used her mancy to mark intersections with small, sharp-edged statues, a breadcrumb trail in frozen stone, so no one would get lost in the maze behind them. Sky talked to the plants scattered around the manor, gathering bits of information to narrow their search. When they finally hit the wing that reeked of fresh cruelty and human terror, everyone knew it. Theo went pale. Valentine's voice dropped into something cold and precise. Their search slowed to a crawl. They found Evan first. He was half conscious, chained to a bed, in a room that looked more like a laboratory than a cell. The panic spike in Theo hit so hard that even Vaughn felt it across the distance. This time it was Jace who moved first, crossing the room in a few long strides. He tore the chains apart with a mix of vampire strength and magic, calling on Philip only when a lock refused to yield. Jace checked Evan's neck and pulse himself, hands careful, in a way that did not match his reputation at all. Valentine explained why. The two of them had been together before Evan was kidnapped. Once Jace was sure Evan was alive, he let Theo rush his brother, while Philip and Valentine organized a quick handoff to get Evan back along the marked path. Vaughn stood in the doorway, watching the hall and waiting for the other shoe to drop. Aluk was deeper in, held in a room that might have passed for normal if you ignored the locks on everything. And the way the window did not open, he met them with a flat, terrified defiance that said he had been given too many reasons not to trust anyone. Theo was the one who broke through it, saying his name the way only family did. The sound of it cracked something in the air. Aluk folded, not because the room was safe now, but because the people at the door carried his brother's voice. Sky stepped in close behind Theo, frozen life energy and a touch of something darker tucked in tight around him, and the recognition that moved over Aluk's face when he saw him left no more doubt in his heart. Getting them out was worse than getting in. The manor knew it was under real threat now, and every hallway turned into a choke point. Vampires who had been content to watch from the shadows joined the fight. Vaughn and Irma went to work as a single weapon, her constructs smashing windows and punching new exits through walls. When the corridors became too crowded, Valentine froze stairwells solid and shattered them under pursuers. Theo and Philip held the line around the Shire brothers with sharp, efficient magic, while Sky weaponized the plant life the vampires had taken for granted, punishing anything that tried to circle around. Jace called the retreats and repositioning, dragging them all closer and closer to the outer storm. They broke out into the blizzard as a single, battered unit. Behind them, the manor stood wounded, but not yet fallen, full of people they had not had time to save. Ahead of them, the snow waited, thick enough to hide in, but treacherous enough to swallow the weak. Vaughn took point again, with Irma at his side, Valentine matching his stride. Between them moved the Shire brothers, Theodore refusing to let go of either of them. They had done what they came to do. The cost of it was a lot of blood, effort, and time. All well worth it to see Theo's brothers safe and sound. By the time they got the Shire brothers settled at La Fay Manor, The storm outside had started to break. Inside, the air felt heavier. The raid had worked. Evan and Aluk were alive and breathing in beds that did not smell like blood. On paper, that was a victory. In the room itself, nobody looked like they believed they had actually won anything. Theo sat between his brothers, one hand on each of them, as if he could anchor all three of them by touch alone. Valentine's shoulders were still tight, his eyes tracking every draft and shadow, as if the manor's ghosts might have followed them home. The conversations started small and practical. Who needed healing first? How stable Evan really was. How much of Aluk's wariness was habit, and how much was damage. Irma hovered near the door at first, watching the three Shires knit themselves back together. Vaughn stayed close to her, big and solid at her shoulder, letting his presence be the wall she could lean against if the memories of the manor clawed too hard. Sky took a place near Aluk, not quite touching at first, speaking low and steady until some of the tension bled out of Aluk's posture. Philip moved between Jace and Valentine, passing messages, checking wards, making sure the space stayed sealed. It was Jace who finally said what everyone else was circling around. The manor had not been a rogue act. It had been allowed to exist. Someone with power had known what was happening there and looked away. If one project like that had taken root this deep in the north, more could follow. Maybe already had. The Vampire Council's reluctance to sanction the raid was not a one-time cowardice. It was a pattern. He laid the pieces out on the table. Valentine's increasingly strained position among his own. Theo's brothers now marked targets. Sky's ties to a boy the North had already tried to exploit. Irma's new ice wraith nature, and the fact that none of them could pretend this was an isolated horror anymore. Fairsilver came up like a joke at first, a place some of them already knew. Jace had been there enough times to have friends in the city, people like Rowan Hilshire, who could help them land without issue. Sky had been born there. His parents and older brother still lived in the local Fey garden. The question was not, can we survive there so much, as are we willing to stop pretending the North is home? Philip started running practical numbers in the background. How much money the move would cost, and what resources they would need to burn to make it possible. Sky added what he knew about the Fey gardens in the city, stating his parents would be so happy to have him home, they would be bending over backwards to help. Theo, who had spent so long with his life, defined by who was missing from it, looked at his brothers and then at Valentine and asked it straight. If they stayed here, how long until the next manor? The answer was not one anyone wanted to say out loud. The room shifted as it settled on them anyway. Evan, pale but stubborn, saying he did not want to wake up in another cell. Aluk, still braced for danger, admitting that if he had to start over, that was fine with him, as long as his family and people were finally safe, and that if Sky wanted to go back to his family, then he was going with him. Irma, arms folded tight over her chest, quietly stated that she owed Valentine and Vaughn her service and her life, and that her life would not be long if she stayed where vampires thought she was a resource instead of a person. One by one, the lines that held them to the north started to look more like chains. The The decision to move came together in pieces, not as some grand oath. Jace talked through the risks of leaving, the enemies they would make, the ties they would cut, and the way his existing contacts could soften the landing. Philip backed him with logistics, already sketching routes and timelines. Sky spoke for the Fairsilver side of things, what he could promise through family and what he could not. Theo spoke for his brothers, voice rough but steady, saying that they would rather face the unknown in the city together than stay scattered and hunted here. Valentine, Vaughn, and Irma traded a look that said they were already imagining what their corner of that new life might look like. By the time the storm fully cleared, the shape of it was set. They would give the North their backs. They would take their bruised, stubborn little constellation and drag it south, not to become something new, but to see who they could be somewhere that had not already decided their fate. The move to Fairsilver did not turn them into different people. It just gave their same problems new streets to walk. Vaughn learned the city in slow loops, mapping it in terms of where his people slept. Sky and Aluk, near Sky's family's garden. Jace, Philip, and Evan anchoring another corner. Jace hovering in the orbit of the nightclub scene, eyeing Lawrence Delaros in much the same way Vaughn had seen Valentine. Theo, another lovely lover to add to his polycule. Valentine, Irma, and Vaughn spun up their own gravity well that Theo orbited without really meaning to. Fairsilver had its own wolves. The Lunar Claw Pack held the territory outside the city, their name coming up any time someone mentioned the local shifters with a wary edge. Anthony Hearthsong lead them. On paper, that had nothing to do with Aurora Fang. In practice, Vaughn heard enough might makes right in the way people described Lunar Claw that he had to see it himself. The first visit confirmed it. Anthony's pack structure felt like someone had taken the worst habits of the North and built a house out of them. Strength measured in how hard you could keep everyone under your thumb. No patience for dissent that was not immediately useful. Vaughn left that first meeting with the decision already made. If this was the pack Fairsilver had to live with, it needed a different Ulfric. He joined Lunar Claw the way a man steps into a burning building with a fire break already in mind. Not to belong, not really, but to be close enough that when he took Anthony down, it would stick. The only variable he had not accounted for yet was how many people would get crushed in the changeover. Green Peace Village was high on that list. Their alliance with Lunar Claw was old and written in teeth and saddle straps. Every year, goblins from Green Peace Village held a choosing ceremony, walking the lines of assembled wolves and picking out mounts from Anthony's ranks. By the time Vaughn stood there with the Lunar Claw wolves, wind cutting through his hair, Gekka was only just starting to step into her own role. Chief's daughter, not yet coronated, still half outsider in her own home. He recognized that immediately. After all, he was a stranger in Fairsilver colors. They noticed each other in the middle of the ceremony noise. Gekka moved down the line with her wooden staff and sharp eyes, goblins trailing behind her in a loose swarm, whispering about which wolves looked fastest, strongest, meanest. When she paused in front of Vaughn, he could feel Anthony's attention prickle along his spine from across the clearing. For a heartbeat, it was possible she might point to him, make a choice he could never accept. Her gaze flicked from his eyes to the frost-edged scars along his skin, then past him to the rest of the row. She kept walking, later away from the crowd. They ended up on the same edge of the firelight, two people technically supposed to belong where they were standing, and not entirely sold on that fact. Vaughn asked about Anthony, the way you test ice on a river, 1 foot at a time. Gekka answered like someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say it out loud. The Ulfric was a pig, brutal and violent. Lunar Claw was riding the line between feared and hated. If he pushed much further, he would take their allies down with him. She did not say she would not cry if someone knocked him off his throne. She did not have to. That was enough. Vaughn filed her under not an obstacle, and quietly maybe an ally when the time came. What he needed was clarity, permission in a way to take the shot. He had been lining up since the first day he walked into Anthony Hearthsong's territory. The next year turned into a quiet sorting process. Vaughn did not give speeches. He watched which wolves ran Anthony's errands with their ears down, which ones looked away when punishments went too far, which ones stepped in, not to defy the Ulfric, but to soften the blow where they could get away with it. He learned the rhythm of Lunar Claw from the inside, slipping into their patrols and hunts, until nobody flinched at seeing him in their colors. Anthony read that as compliance. Vaughn let him. Anthony's son Jason was always there at the edge of things, close enough to be counted, far enough away you could almost pretend he did not belong to the man at the center. The way Jason's jaw clenched when his father grabbed a subordinate by the scruff for daring to speak up, the way he knelt later to wrap a bandage that should have been offered by the Ulfric himself, the way he never joined in when the others tried to turn cruelty into a joke. It was the same look Vaughn had seen on too many kids in the north who knew exactly what their fathers were behind closed doors. Vaughn expected to have to approach him eventually to weigh the risk of dragging Anthony's bloodline into a rebellion against him. He did not get the chance. Jason got there first. It was late, the kind of pack night where most of Lunar Claw had already drifted off to bed or out into the woods. Vaughn was checking gear in the armory, running his fingers over worn leather and half-maintained weapons when he heard footsteps in the doorway and caught the familiar Hearthsong scent under smoke and cold iron. He did not turn right away. If this was about to become a problem, he wanted the rack of spears between them. Jason hinted at his knowledge without ever fully confronting him. His voice stayed low enough not to carry, sharp enough that it still felt like a challenge. Vaughn tried to play the fool, hoping Jason was bluffing, but Jason laid out the pattern anyway. He gestured toward the small stage where Anthony conducted business, describing the way Vaughn watched the pack whenever Anthony put on a show, the way he always seemed to find the wolves Anthony broke afterward. He made it clear he was no slouch like his father, that he had grown up in Anthony's shadow and knew exactly what it looked like when someone was lining up a challenge. He knew a coup when he smelled one. For a heartbeat, Vaughn considered denying everything anyway, playing the dumb outsider long enough to walk this conversation off a cliff. But Jason was not posturing. His stance was solid, his hands empty, his gaze steady in a way that said he had already thought through the danger of being here. Vaughn shifted to face him fully and asked calmly that if Jason already knew his plans, why he was standing here instead of running to his father. Jason's answer only confirmed what Vaughn had already suspected. Anthony was no true Ulfric in his eyes. There was an old tiredness in the way he said it that did not belong on someone his age. He talked about the way his father ran the pack like a choke chain, taking and taking, putting down anyone who tried to breathe, and how that did not change once they were off pack grounds. He did not go into details. He did not have to. Vaughn had seen enough bruises that did not match training accidents, enough flinches when Anthony reached for his son too fast. The picture filled itself in. Jason admitted he had been planning something for a while, but never had the courage or the support to act on his own. To most of the pack, he was just Anthony's son, another extension of the same problem. He pointed out the same risks Vaughn had been quietly tallying. Fairsilver, Lunar Claw, and Green Peace Village sat on a delicate axis. If they upset that balance the wrong way, Anthony would not be their only problem. A bad coup could shatter the pack, cost them allies, and leave 3 territories worse off than before. Then, to Vaughn's surprise, Jason offered to help. For Vaughn, it was already the same risks. He had already been calculating. The difference was Jason had knowledge that he did not. Vaughn had come to Fairsilver as a warrior and was ready to burn a tyrant down. Jason forced him to think like an Ulfric before he ever wore the title. Together, in the quiet corners of the pack's territory, they started sketching a different kind of coup, not a sudden strike from the outside, but a controlled transition from within. They made lists. Wolves whose loyalty was to the pack instead of the man at the top. Goblin riders who would not follow Lunar Claw into pointless wars. City contacts who could confirm how far Anthony's reputation had already rotted. Jason brought an insider's knowledge of which levers moved the pack. Vaughn brought a lifetime of watching northern elders underestimate what their weaker wolves could do when pushed too far. The work did not look like rebellion. At first glance, Jason took on more visible duties, stepping in to handle disputes before Anthony could turn them into public punishments. Vaughn volunteered for the ugliest patrols, the ones that would have left weaker wolves grateful to their Ulfric for any scrap of attention. Quietly, he made sure the gratitude pointed sideways instead of up. When Anthony snarled, Jason translated it into orders that did not break anyone's spine. When Anthony demanded harsher discipline, Vaughn offered alternatives that got results without tearing the pack apart. Each compromise shaved a little authority off the man at the top and shifted it to the 2 of them instead. Gekka became their unofficial barometer. On paper, she was just the chief's daughter from Green Peace Village, the village's future leader. In practice, she sat at the point where goblin patience met wolf behavior. Vaughn made a habit of drifting to her side of the fire. Whenever he was visiting the village, he asked how the riders were talking about Lunar Claw this season, whether they were proud to wear Anthony's colors or just tolerating them because there were no better options. Gekka's answers were blunt as ever. Sometimes she called Anthony a pig, and the pack cowards to their faces. Sometimes she admitted things had felt less like living under a storm and more like waiting out a drizzle. Each time, Vaughn filed it away with Jason's reports from inside the pack. Rumors moved ahead of Anthony. Whenever he went into Fairsilver, stories of rough handling turned into reports of outright cruelty. Old allies started hedging their bets, sending feelers toward Jason and Vaughn instead of the Ulfric himself. In Green Peace Village, Gekka heard the same stories from a different angle. Riders came back from runs with more complaints about Anthony's temper and more grudging respect for the way Jason and Vaughn were handling things on the ground. Wolves, who used to joke about goblins as living saddle weights, started talking about them as partners worth keeping. By the time the next choosing ceremony rolled around, the mood around the fire had shifted. When Gekka looked at the Lunar Claw pack, she did not just see Anthony's pack. She saw two different futures, standing side by side. The break itself did not come as a dramatic duel under the moon. It came in a council meeting that should have been routine. Anthony pushed for a raid that would have dragged both Fairsilver and Green Peace into a war they had not agreed to. Jason called it reckless. Vaughn called it unsustainable. When Anthony tried to shut them down by citing his title, half the elders did not look at him. They looked at Jason and Vaughn. Anthony realized all at once that he was no longer speaking for the pack. He was arguing with it. There was a long, ugly stretch where Anthony tried to drag things back to the old pattern. Raised voice, threats, the promise of punishments that would remind everyone who owned this ground. This time, nobody moved aside. Jason stepped between his father and the rest of the room, not as an obedient heir, but as a wall. Vaughn backed his play with the kind of calm that made it clear he was ready for this to turn into a fight, and confident about which way it would go. Around them, wolves who had been quietly weighing their options made their choice with their feet and their eyes. They stood behind Jason and Vaughn. Anthony could have pushed it into blood. He had done it before, and for much less. What changed was not in his mind, but in a sudden revelation in his heart, all centered around Salazar Ravenwood. News of the Demon Project had already reached them in scattered pieces. Experiments that pulled trauma from people in the hopes of reviving others. Old ghosts clawed back into the light. In the middle of it, Anthony's lost love had come back from the dark. Salazar was not the monster demon king he had been. That alone made Anthony want for a better life. Salazar had pulled Anthony up from the dark, alongside him, with love alone. Minerva's return had forced Salazar to look hard at the person he had become and start clawing his way towards something better. Watching that dragged something similar loose in Anthony, even if it stung. Facing his son and a pack that no longer reflexively bowed. With Salazar's slow, painful work toward change still too fresh in his mind, Anthony finally saw the shape of what he had made. The bruises, the fear, the way Jason flinched like a kicked dog when he reached for him too fast, the way his own wolves were ready to fight him to protect each other. He folded in on himself with a tiredness that had nothing to do with age. The step down was not graceful. He spat, he snarled. He tried to frame it as a tactical move instead of an admission of guilt. But when he offered the title of Ulfric to Jason, it was not a test. It was penance in the only language he had left. Jason refused without hesitation. He said, in front of the whole pack, that Vaughn was the one who had given him the courage to stand up in the first place, the one who understood what leadership should cost. If Lunar Claw was going to survive this, it needed someone whose first loyalty was to the pack as a whole, not to bloodlines or old grudges. Vaughn accepted, because saying no would have left a vacuum Anthony's enemies could have filled with something worse. He did it with his eyes open, knowing exactly how many scars he was inheriting. The first thing he did was change the name. Lunar Claw belonged to Anthony's era. Under Vaughn, they would be the Jade Claw clan, a pack defined as much by its riders and allies as by the wolves themselves. He reached out to Gekka and Green Peace Village, not as a superior demanding tribute, but as a neighbor offering terms. Gekka met him halfway, staff in hand, the weight of her own village's expectations sitting squarely on her shoulders. By then, she was more than the chief's daughter. She too had inherited her father's legacy, now leading Green Peace Village as their chiefess. She was the one keeping Green Peace steady with soup, sharp words, and an iron refusal to let anyone pretend things were fine when they were not. The agreement they forged was not a simple renewal of old contracts. It was a rebalancing. Wolves would protect goblin lands as fiercely as their own hunting grounds. Riders would treat their mounts as partners with a voice in how and where they fought. In return, Green Peace would stand as Jade Claw's first line of warning and its loudest conscience, free to call them out the moment they started to look too much like the regimes they had escaped. Under Vaughn and Gekka, the Jade Claw clan stopped being just a pack and a village on a map and became a single axis running through Fairsilver's woods, holding 3 different communities together every time the world tried to pull them apart. Nowadays, Vaughn splits his life between 3 centers of gravity and pretends it is simple. At home, he is the quiet man in the townhouse kitchen, making sure Irma remembers to put her sculptures down long enough to eat. And Valentine actually relaxes before the sun comes up. Out in the woods, he is the Ulfric of the Jade Claw clan, running patrols with an ice-armored shadow and a wraith on his back, listening more than he talks, while his wolves and goblin riders argue about routes and training schedules. In Green Peace Village, he is Gekka's co-conspirator, taste-testing soup at the wooden spoon while they dissect the latest bit of gossip nonsense and decide which problem is worth getting involved in. He is still the boy who chose one vampire's voice over an entire northern pack, but the axis has widened. Every day is a new round of triage between Valentine's eternity, Theo's borrowed brothers, Irma's fragile sense of self, Jason's bruised loyalty, and Gekka's village that refuses to settle for surviving when it could be doing better. Vaughn does not kid himself that he can save everyone. What he can do is make sure that the people and places under his watch are never treated like tools again, even if it means carrying more weight on his own shoulders than any one wolf was ever meant to bear. Personality, Vaughn looks like the quiet type until you actually bounce off him. He's blunt as hell, quick to roll his eyes, and faster to tell you when you're being stupid, which means most people meet that soon long before they ever clock the Dara. Underneath that, he's embarrassingly soft with a very specific circle. Valentine, Theo, Irma, Jason, Gekka, and his wolves can get away with using him as a space heater or draping over his shoulders. Everyone else gets teeth if they try. If anyone calls him on it, he will deny every good deed he has ever done and turn bright metaphorical red, then go right back to quietly fixing whatever he was fixing. That softness is welded to a brutal protective streak. Vaughn does not start fights, but he absolutely finishes them, and he has no problem putting his body between his people. And anything that looks like a repeat of the systems that hurt them, he thinks in terms of routes, exits, and who needs watching, carrying an invisible pack-weights list in his head at all times. The masochism shows up in how he handles that load. He used to stay in bad roles because he thought that was what he was for. Now he volunteers for the hardest jobs, longest patrols, and heaviest emotional lifting because it scratches the itch to hurt and helps keep everyone else out of the fire. He will never call it that. As far as he's concerned, that's just what the Ulfric is for. Physically, Vaughn is pure outdoors athletic. He runs for the sake of running, picks fights in the dirt, just to feel teeth on his shoulders, and comes home from the woods scraped up and exhausted with his hair, a mess more nights than not. He relaxes best mid-movement, sparring, play wrestling with Pack, or hauling gear through the trees with Irma on his back. Anything that lets him chew through restless energy without having to talk. The combination leaves him reading as Loki and steady from a distance, but up close, he's a very specific brand of cuddly menace. A Tsundir Pack dad who will grumble the whole time he's making you soup, then fall asleep, sitting up with someone's head on his chest, and swear he doesn't like this kind of thing at all. Appearance, Vaughn is a very tall 15-year-old with a runner's build, all long lines and coiled muscle rather than bulk. His skin holds the pale, cold-toned look of someone who grew up under northern skies, and it only makes the gold of his eyes stand out sharper when he's annoyed or amused. His hair is steel blue shot through, with natural-looking silver highlights, usually short enough to stay out of his face, but still messy, like he's either just rolled out of bed or just rolled out of the woods. Up close, his arms and collarbones are mapped with small scars from training, patrols, and a lifetime of throwing himself between sharp things and other people. In wolf form, he's an Arctic wolf with the same steel blue and silver palette to his fur, the ice armor plates and spines from Valentine's imprint layering over it when he calls on their bond. Vaughn dresses for movement more than looks, usually in worn-in jeans or athletic pants, layered shirts, and boots that can handle a patrol as easily as a grocery run. Most days, he looks like he's either heading out on a hunt or just got back from one. Abilities: Valentine's Frostbite. Vaughn was born to the Aurora Fang Pack in North Point, but everything changed when he imprinted on the Yuki, Ona Vampire Valentine LaFay, at 6 years old, and his ice magic fused into his blood. When he shifts, that bond lets him call intense cold and grow plates and spines of frozen armor along his body, turning his Arctic wolf form into a living weapon of ice and frost. He uses this power to harden himself into a shield on the front line, crack cages and restraints that trap his people, and control the cold around his pack core during raids, storms, and any fight where winter is an advantage. Glacial Tank. Vaughn was already a big, sturdy Arctic wolf shifter, but growing up in North Point and training through real raids, storms, and the Manor Rescue hardened that frame into something built for punishment. His body runs cold and dense, letting him soak hits that would drop most people, stay on his feet through blood loss and exhaustion, and keep moving long after he should be down. He uses this to anchor the front line, hold doors, and choke points by himself when he has to, and take the brunt of damage so Valentine, Theo, Irma, and the rest of his pack can keep fighting or escape. Silent Tundra Sense. Vaughn was born in North Point and spent his early life running Aurora Fang territory, then later took Jade Claw into harsher ground around Fairsilver, and all those years taught his body how to live inside snow and ice instead of just walking on top of it. This power shows up as a deep, quiet awareness of terrain, letting him feel where the ground will give, red storms and unfavorable conditions, and track people or threats through insane weather when normal senses would fail. He uses it to guide his pack safely through foul weather, set up better ambushes and escape routes, and keep Valentine, Theo, Irma, and the rest from vanishing into the kind of weather that swallows people whole. That's it for loyal Vaughn. His tale was a long one, but one certainly worth getting invested in. Farewell for now, my dear. Please come back anytime to hear more stories from my world.